following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
I am back, as promised, with two of the most interesting people on the planet. In this case, they're New York Ranger hockey historians. George Grimm, Howell Bock. George, how are you?
I'm good, Ralph. Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. You grace the airways from time to time, and we always come away with good memories of our youth. Howell Bock, same goes for you, my friend.
Well, thank you, Ralph. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we have a good time reliving the days in Madison Square Garden. For me, it was with my Geo ticket intact, buying a $75 seat, and when they opened the gate, that we raced up to the upper deck and tried to get side seats or the best view. It was just part of my winters. Afternoons watching the Knicks and evenings watching the Rangers. So, George, you've written many books, hockey books, Ranger books in particular. What have you got going on right now that you want to tell the Comfortably Zoned audience about?
Well, right now I like to talk about Emil Francis. I recently posted a column on InsideHockey.com, my Retro Rangers column, and I think it's time that the Rangers honor Emil in some way. They've already honored 5 of his players by retiring their numbers on the rafters, and it's time that they honor him, because when he took over the Rangers in '64, they were in bad shape. They hadn't made the playoffs in 4 or 5 years. The attendance was down. Some of the better players in the league didn't want to come here to play. And now, 50-odd years later, the Rangers are worth $1.5 billion with a B. They're the tops in the NHL, and a lot of that is due to Emil's work with the Rangers. When he came over, hello?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
We're listening.
Yeah. When he came over, he took over for Muzz Patrick, and he reorganized the franchise from top to bottom. He added to the scouting department. He brought in bigger players because the Rangers were a small team back then. They were one of the smallest teams in the league. And he brought in guys like Wayne Hillman and Orland Kurtenbach and Reggie Fleming, guys who were big and tough and who would be able to protect the smaller players. And he also he installed the systems with the team as far as how he wanted them to bring the puck out of their zone, how he wanted them to kill off power plays and things like that. And he also had all the teams in the Ranger systems use that same system so that the players coming up would know what to do when they got here. But
right. Now, Howell Bock, you worked for the Rangers back in those days.
Sure did.
And you remember Emil Francis.
Oh, do I ever? I'll tell you a funny story about Emil. He had been at Kitchener with the Ranger Farm Club, and they brought him to New York to become the general manager, as George said, to succeed Muzz Patrick. And this happened in 1962. I guess he was the assistant general manager at that point.
Right.
And I was in my second year as an intern, sort of, in the public relations department. And America got itself involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it was a very, very tense time in this country. For those of you who remember that, it looked like we were going to go to war.
Right.
And the papers were full of news about the missiles, and John F. Kennedy was meeting with his cabinet and all of this stuff. And Emil was Emil was concerned with the Rangers at that point, but he also was concerned with the world situation. And one day he came into the office, and he had a newspaper, I guess it was the Times, and they had printed a grid of where the Cuban missiles could reach, what the range of those missiles would be. And Emil, in this dark, dark time in America, came in and said, "I've got great news." And I thought, well, what did he come up with? He's got the paper spread out on his desk, and he said, look at this. North Battleford is out of the range of those missiles. North Battleford, South Saskatchewan, of course, was where Emil grew up, or was born and grew up. And he was very happy to see that his birthplace would be protected when the missiles started flying. So everybody got a pretty good laugh at a difficult time in America in that office that day. Emil was a magnificent guy. I mean, he was a peanut-sized guy. He was a little guy, but he had the heart of a giant, and he knew his hockey inside out. He knew what the Rangers needed, and he went about accomplishing that and achieving that. And he had them as contenders every year. They were up there in the top rung of the league. They didn't win the cup under Emil, unfortunately, but they certainly competed for it. And George remembers that, as I do. I worked my first year at the Rangers. I worked for Muzz Patrick, and he was he was a different sort of a general manager. Muzz was an old player and hail fellow, well met. Emil was a business guy, down to earth and down to nuts and bolts about hockey and about how to win games. So they were really very different guys, and both of them occupy a warm place in my heart because I got my feet wet in hockey under those two guys, under those two general managers. So they're
now,
special.
They were general managers. Were they taking care of non-player related things on the Rangers, like day-to-day running of the team?
Sure. I mean, the general manager was in charge of the club. He made trades. He administered the operation. I'll tell you a story about
the business side of it, not the player side of it.
To some extent.
Like ordering cups, that kind of stuff.
Well, no, I don't think he did that. No, I don't think he was involved in that sort of thing. But I'll give you an example of the kind of guy Muzz was. My first year at the Rangers, the Eastern College Athletic Conference decided that it was going to have a holiday hockey tournament at Madison Square Garden. They had been very successful with the Christmas festival in basketball, the holiday festival, not Christmas, the holiday festival in basketball. They brought 8 teams into the Garden, and it was a sellout every night and so forth. And somebody came up with the idea that, well, if basketball sold in the holidays, why can't hockey sell? So they were going to bring 4 teams into Madison Square Garden for a holiday hockey tournament. And they decided, since I was the low man on the totem pole, this was going to be my baby. I had to promote this. I had to write all the releases about it. I had to do it all. And I was very enthusiastic about it because it was an opportunity to show that I knew a thing or two and I could do a thing or two.
Right.
So I went about trying to promote this holiday hockey tournament. Clarkson was involved, and I think St. Lawrence was involved. Not exactly mainstream New York teams, not St. John's and Columbia, So, but I just jumped right into it. I put the program together. I called the coaches. I interviewed the coaches. I wrote all the copy for the program, and just the whole thing. And now comes opening night, and as George will tell you, the sellout crowd at Madison Square Garden, the number was 15,925. That was a sellout.
Hockey, yeah.
And opening night of the holiday hockey tournament, we drew 15,925 fans.
Wow.
Holy mackerel, we've got a hit on our hands.
Good for you, yeah.
And it was a 2-night tournament, and we sold the joint out. everybody was thrilled. And now Muzz was not really involved in the holiday hockey tournament, but he was very happy to see what the numbers were.
Sure.
And so he called my boss, who was a guy named Herb Gorin. Gorin was an old baseball writer who at that time in his life was working in the Ranger front office in public relations, and he was my boss. And Muzz Patrick called him, and he said, Herbie, wow, who did this? Who promoted this? And Herbie said, my assistant, Hal Bock. Send him in here. So I went in to see Muzz. I had never talked to the man. I had been hired by Herb Gorin. Muzz was up in Kitchener with the club when I was hired. I never saw him. I never talked to him. But now I'm on the carpet. He calls me in, and he says, did you do this? And I said, yes, Mr. Patrick, I did. He said, what'd you do? And I told him the whole story. I called all the coaches and did all the press releases and so forth, called around town, called the newspapers to alert them that what was going on. And he says, how much money do you make? So now I'm really scared. And I said, I make $75 a week. This is in 1962, right? $75 a week. And he says, well, I'm giving you a $25 a week raise retroactive.
Wow.
And my jaw dropped. I said, now, suddenly from 75, I was now making $100 a week, and I was going to get a check for about $225 retroactive pay. I'm thinking I can retire on this. I'm on Easy Street now. And that's my great memory of Muzz Patrick. I'll always be grateful to him for what he did that day. It's always a fun time. It was a great time in my life.
Talking about a Hall of Fame hockey player as well.
Yes, he was.
So that you're sitting in that office thinking not only the boss, but the athletic part of it.
I knew who Muzz was. Don't kid yourself.
Yes.
And don't forget, he was a part of a great family, as George will tell you. His father was Lester Patrick, who ran the Rangers in the 20s, and his brother was Lynn Patrick, who also played for the Rangers and ran the Boston Bruins for a while. So this is hockey royalty we're talking about. And I'm this kid.
How about this? They had a son, Muzz's grandson,
Greg,
who played for the Seals out here, and I got to know him a little through Stan Gilbertson, and later went on to be a general manager himself.
Yes, that's right, the Pittsburgh Penguins. And also he was involved in the Miracle on Ice, the 1980 college kids who beat the Russians in the Olympics and went on to win the gold medal. Craig had a role in that team as well.
Right, he was actually...
Didn't know that. As a player?
No. He was a general manager.
By then, okay, wow.
So we're talking about hockey royalty, and I'm this kid out of NYU who doesn't know up from down really about where I was or what I was doing. But it was a great moment in my life, and I'll never forget it.
Nice. George, back to you a little bit. I want to hear your voice.
All right, getting back
what
to...
What was your first hockey game as a kid?
It was at the Old Garden. Of course, it was at the early 60s. It was one of the first games that I went to. Gilles Villemure was in goal because Jacques Plante was hurt. So they called Gilles Villemure up from wherever he was, whatever minor league team he was on, and he didn't have the mask on. And now, if anybody knows Gilles Villemure, he's famous for this pale orange mask with almost like a grin on it. And he didn't have that mask on. He didn't wear a mask then. And this was like in the early 60s. And we sat up in the end balcony because the side balcony, if you weren't in the first couple rows, you couldn't see half the ice. So, but we were in the end balcony, so we had pretty good seats. And after those games, my father would take me down by the ice and he'd show me the bench and show me the penalty box. And after that, I grew up watching the Rangers on Channel 9 and Channel 11 with Win Elliott and Bob Wolf, calling the play-by-play. on the Schaefer Circle of Sports. Schaefer, the one beer to have when you're having more than one. And I was a season ticket holder at the New Garden for a good long time, about 20 years, I guess. And then in '88, I created Sportstat, the Ranger Report, my own little newsletter for the Rangers. Then I moved on to the Blue Shirt Bulletin. Now I'm writing for Inside Hockey. And along the way, I wrote 2 books, We Did Everything But Win, about the Emil Francis era Rangers, which came out 2 years ago. And I have a book coming out this September called Guardians of the Goal, which traces the history of the Ranger goaltenders, with 8 franchise goaltenders. And they would be Davey Kirk, Chuck Rena, Gump Worsley, Ed Jockerman, John Davidson, John Van Beesbrook, Mike Richter, and Henrik Lundqvist. 8 franchise goaltenders. So
Nice.
Ranger bio.
Very cool.
I'll tell you a story about another goaltender that you don't have on your list, who played here briefly, but was one of the great goaltenders in the NHL, and his name was Jacques Plante. Don't forget, the Rangers traded Gump Worsley to Montreal for Jacques Plante. And I remember the outrage of trading Gump was, certainly one of the stalwarts of that team, of that group of guys, and they were trading him away for a guy who was maybe one of the best goalies in the league at that time. Yeah. It was a landmark deal, really a big deal. But Plante was a character. He often denied playing. He refused to play in Toronto. He said he couldn't play in Toronto because they used a certain cleanser in the dressing room that affected his breathing.
Yeah,
stuff like that. He had stuff that came up. And I remember at this point in his Ranger stay, he was in the hospital with a knee injury. And the doctor, the Rangers doctor at that time, and George will remember this name, Kazuo Yanagazawa, a Japanese doctor.
Yeah, spell that.
Right? You remember him?
Yes, spell it.
So anyway, I went to see Jock in the hospital because I wanted to do a story. By that point I was working for the Associated Press, and I wanted to do a story on Jock. So I went to the hospital, and I went to his room, and in his Gaelic accent, I said, "How you doing?" And in his Gaelic accent, he said, "That son of a beach Japanese doctor." I said, "What? Dr. Yanagazawa?" He said, "Yes, son of a beach." I said, "Whoa, what?" Apparently, Yanagazawa didn't believe that Jock was really hurt. So he had Jock lift his leg, and he held a cigarette lighter under his knee to see if Jock could respond. So Jock was very angry at that piece of business. But again, those were great days, great memories that I have of that era in Ranger history.
Now, you have a mask in your garage. Tell us about that.
You bet I do. My son, who I like to call my son the lawyer, he's a lawyer today, grew up not playing Little League baseball, but he chose to play Little League hockey. And we had a rink where the Rangers worked out, actually, about 2 blocks from our home. And so I went to the owner of the rink, and I asked him about the program, and he said, "Oh, yeah, have him enroll him in this program, and he can play here," and so forth. And he did. And Richard, my son Richard, came to the rink the first day, and he looked around, and he said, "I think I want to be the goaltender." I said, "Rich, come on. You know how much you have to wear all that equipment, and they shoot the puck at you? That's not good." But he was not interested in skating up and down the rink, up and down the ice, rather. So I said, "Okay, you want to be the goalie? Be the goalie." And shortly thereafter, Jacques Plante, who was an entrepreneur, came out and started manufacturing goalie masks. And Richard, my boy Richard, said, "I got to have them. I want the Plante mask." "No problem, my son." So I sent away a check for I don't know how much money, and back came the mask the Jock Plant model mask. It was masked. It was sales receipt number 2. I don't know who got number 1, but I got number 2. And that mask resides in my garage as a memory of my son's hockey career, which lasted from the time he was about 7 till the time he was about 14. And again, those are great memories, and I'm grateful that I've had them.
Now, you just told me something. I thought the Rangers practiced above the old garden.
They did. They did.
There was
Iceland.
It
was called Iceland.
Yeah, and it had metal boards, supposedly.
But that's not the practice rink you were referring to.
No, when Emile Francis came along, he established a Ranger community in a town called Long Beach here on Long Island. And he needed a rink for workouts. He thought that Iceland was a terrible facility, and it was.
It was, yes.
And so he arranged for the Rangers to work out in a rink at that time called Skateland. It was here in New Hyde Park, which is the town next to where I was living at that time. So the Rangers practiced in Skateland during the Francis years. The Iceland era was before Emile took over the franchise.
Yeah, that was a small rink. It had metal boards. Supposedly, one of the ends of the rink was like square. It wasn't rounded like a regular rink, and it was small. They couldn't even hold like a regular practice up there. Jacques Plante is actually the reason why Muzz Patrick got fired. In his last year with the Rangers, he was hurt, and they had sent him down to their farm club down in Baltimore, and he was interviewed by a reporter down there, and he badmouthed the Rangers terribly. Everything about the Rangers, from management to training facilities to everything.
Who was that you said, George?
Excuse me?
Who was the player you're talking about?
Jacques Plante.
Oh, Jacques. Okay, yeah.
And then he was called back up to MSG with Patrick, to say what happened, why he said those things, and they had a press conference, and Muzz Patrick got into a shouting match with Stan Frischler, and he called him a prick, and then Bill Jennings, was upset about that. He was president of the Rangers at the time, and he asked Muzz to resign, and that's how Emil. It was October of 1964, 8 games into the season, and that's why Emil became a GM, because at that point he was in the right place at the right time, and Jennings had he was the only one there he could turn to, to take over the team.
Right. Just a note too. We're talking about the original 6 years, and to put things into some perspective, the Rangers had like a 5th defenseman, Larry Cahan. I don't know if you guys remember him.
Yes,
he
wasn't. He won number 5.
That's right, number 5, exactly.
He was.
His name was Hank.
He was a big, tough guy, but he wasn't the greatest defenseman of his time. Remember, 6 teams. It was really different. Expansion comes along. Cahan is looked back upon. He spends like 15 years in the league after those Ranger years. He's looked back upon as one of the solid players going. My point is, expansion really diluted things. And I wonder how the Rangers would have fared if it weren't for St. Louis coming in, taking Red Berenson, this, that, and the other thing. Have you guys thought about that? Would have they been a force had expansion did not occurred?
Well, you know, that when it was a 6-team league, and I mentioned this to George the other day in an email, when the NHL was a 6-team league, 4 of the teams, Chicago, Detroit, and the 2 Canadian teams, Montreal and Toronto, every year were the first 4 teams, and the 5th and 6th team were the Rangers and the Bruins, Boston Bruins.
Right.
And the only chance the Rangers ever had for making the playoffs was getting to 4th place. If they could get to 4th place, that would put them in the playoffs for the Stanley Cup, essentially the semifinals. That's much different than it is today, obviously, when they have 30-odd teams running around. The other day, not the other day, but one day during the winter, we were watching the sports news on TV, and the reporter said, "Here's the hockey score: Arizona 4 and Boston 2."
Mm-hmm.
And my wife looked at me and she said, "Arizona? Arizona has a hockey team?" I said, "You don't know the half of it. Columbus has a hockey team," and on and on and on. So, sure, they've diluted the talent by adding all these teams. In those days, in the 6-team league, the American Hockey League had players who, and that was the number 1 minor league, who had players who really belonged in the NHL, who were good enough to play in the NHL, but never had the opportunity because there were only 6 teams. There was no room. Expansion provided opportunities for a lot of players who otherwise might not have made it to the major leagues of hockey.
No question about that, but there was also the WHL, and I think that diluted it even further.
Well, Emil Francis, when I interviewed him, he had said that after the first expansion, they had thought that it would take about 5 years for the level of play to get back up to where it was. But then the WHA came along, and that blew everything out of whack too. So it really took a long time to get the level of play back to where it was. But at that time, the Rangers were getting better. They had Brad Park coming in, Walker Chuk. They had Eddie Jacquemin, and at that time they were getting better. As were the Bruins. The Bruins brought in Bobby Orr, and he was the best player of his time. Those years that the Bruins and the Rangers finished in 4th and 5th place, the people who the people who were on TV and the newsletters actually made up this cup they called the Patrick Cup, which was named after the Patrick brothers, because Lynn was the GM of the Bruins and Muzz was the GM of the Rangers. So they made up this cup that the teams would play for. It didn't really exist, but it was like a fictional thing that they had.
A little inside hockey.
Yeah.
If you will.
I'll tell you this, those teams were not great teams, but the players, and I was talking to my wife about this the other day, the players on that team that I worked for were the greatest people you could imagine. Nice guys, just gentlemen, really pleasant people to be around, pleasant people to work with. In my first year, toward the end of my first year, the Rangers brought up their number 1 prospect because things were so blue and, really they needed some help. And they brought up this 20-year-old French-Canadian kid from the minor leagues. And he was the same age as I was. And he would hang around in our office all the time. And his name was Rod Gilbert. And Rod was the nicest, sweetest guy you could imagine. And when we got a call, can we get a player to appear at a function at a veterans hospital or this or that, Rod was the first one to go. Rod would go anywhere, everywhere, because that's the kind of guy he was. The rest of the team, and I remember them like brothers. They were so sweet. Harry Howell, many of the Rangers lived in a community called Glen Oaks here on Long Island. Okay. It's a garden apartment community. And Harry Howell was shopping one day, and my mother, who had no idea what I was up to, I mean, she just didn't know, but she saw this guy walking around in a Ranger jacket. That's Harry Howell. So she walked up to him. She said, "Are you with the Rangers?" He said, "Yes, ma'am, I am." She said, "Do you know my son? My son's name is Howell Bock." She says, "Yeah, Hal works in the publicity office." And my mother was thrilled that she found somebody who knew who I was and knew that I wasn't out on the street someplace, you know. And Harry was just a gem. We've lost so many of them. Harry passed away a couple of months ago, I guess.
Right.
Yeah. But they were just such great guys. I mean, just sweet people, nice people. Andy Bathgate. I did a book with Andy Bathgate and Bob Wolf. Probably I guess it was the first book I ever did. And I did a book with Roger Albert and Stan Fischler. So, I mean, these were just people who you want to bring them home. You know, bring them
when
home.
When I was a kid, the number one line with the Rangers was Ingerfield playing center, Prentice playing left, and Bathgate left wing.
Exactly.
Bathgate on right.
And Andy Bathgate on the right wing. And Bathgate's problem was he played right wing. Well, there was this guy in Montreal, you know, named Maurice the Rocket Richard, and he had a friend named Bernie Geoffrion, and they were right wings. And then you had this fellow named Gordie Howe. And so Andy would never get the recognition that he should have gotten as a premier player. And I was grateful that the Rangers eventually traded Andy to Toronto, and they won the Stanley Cup with him. And I was grateful that Andy got his name on the cup because he certainly deserved it.
Yeah. Came for Bob Nevin, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe you're right. And Nevin also was a sweet guy. Just nice guys. People you want for your next-door neighbor, you know?
Right. Good memories, guys.
Well, on those teams, there was a guy named Val Fontaine. And I think Ralph has...
You remember that. I wasn't even... because I told that story, and I didn't want to bore you.
Oh, no.
I was a kid.
I looked him up. I got everything you want to know about Val Fontaine right here in front of me.
He was there only briefly, though, right?
Yes. The 19...
He was a penalty killer, along with Henry Camille was his
Camille Henry.
Camille Henry, right.
Camille Henry.
Oh, wow.
Another sweet guy. Another fun guy to be around.
Val Fontaine and Camille Henry were two of the smallest players in the league. Val was 5'9", 170 pounds, and Camille the Eel was listed as 5'10" and 150 pounds, but they don't think he was that big. Val Fontaine is 85 years old now. He's still living in Western Canada. He actually played in 820 games in the NHL, and he only got 13. In those 820 games, he only got 13 minor penalties, 26 penalty minutes in 820 games. He was a very clean player.
Well, and I'll repeat the story. I'm a kid. I'm outside of the Rangers, outside somewhere on the street, with the blue book, little pocket-sized book, like a yearbook of the Rangers. And
65, Roger Baird on the cover.
Right, and I say, and Val Fontaine is coming in. And for some reason, I had an envelope that a returned address stamped envelope. And I said, Mr. Fontaine, my voice would go up, Val, would you do me a favor and could you get some autographs for me on this book and then send it to me and autograph it yourself? He goes in the Ranger dressing room and he gets literally everybody on that team to sign it, including Gilbert, including Plant, not including Villemere, who was, in those days, they'd come up and down to the minors, backup goalie. He wasn't there. He passed away recently, and which means I'll never get that completed. I still have that, one of my, all-time great possessions of those days. Like I say, Jacques Plant, Gilbert, Hatfield, terrific. He was a good guy. I'd like to have him as a guest. Get his number for me, George.
Yeah. Anyway, he played 2 years with the Rangers. He played 96 games, scored 7 goals and 19 assists, and 6 minutes. Wow. But he had value, and then they lost him in the waiver draft back to the Red Wings. He also played for Pittsburgh and Edmonton in WHA, and he played 13 years in the NHL and 2 years in the World Hockey Association.
Yeah, that's a real good example, because as sweet a guy as he wasn't the best player amongst the best players in the league when it was 6 teams, and he goes on to have a terrific career. So that good example of what we're talking about, how expansion gave many players jobs, and and like Howell was talking, there are teams in Florida, there were teams in Arizona, Las Vegas had an expansion team that damn near won the cup, which really something to think about.
Well, talking about that, with the 16 league, back then, I could name every player on every team.
Exactly.
On most teams, I could name every player by the number, by the way to look. You could name every player. Now, if you ask me to name all 31, soon to be 32 teams in the NHL, I'd have to think about it. I'd have to sit down with a piece of paper and think about it, because it just got way out of hand.
Well, the original expansion was unreal. I mean, that never happened before. They doubled the size of the league from 6 to 12 in 1 year.
Right.
What was 1966 or 67, somewhere in there?
Yeah.
And suddenly you had 12 teams where there had been 6, and that really shook things up in the National Hockey League. And I remember
not only that, St. Louis was named the Blues, and that offended me.
Why?
Why?
I think it was a good nickname.
The Rangers with the blue shirts.
Oh, well, yeah, that's true. That's true. But St. Louis Blues, is a great song.
Oh, that was great. And like I say, they got Berenson from the Rangers, and he was a star, and I thought that was cool. But just the idea, the Blues, you always thought of the Rangers as like I say, the blue shirts.
Right. Well, that was the year, too, that the NHL mandated that every team dress to the regular goaltender and a backup goaltender. So you opened up 6 more spots for goaltenders, plus you added 6 more teams. So you added 12 out west in the expansion area. So there's 18
goalies.
Yeah, 18.
Oh yeah, it definitely made it less Bush when the guy from the press box doesn't have to come down if the goalie is hurt. That kind of thing.
That's right. Well, Joe Schaefer was the backup goalie at Madison Square Garden. He was a statistician, and he sat in the press box. And if the goalie, either team, the visiting team or the Rangers, if the goalie got hurt, and sometimes they did, Joe Schaefer was pressed into action. And in fact, Plant was playing for the Canadiens in the Garden in November of 1959, and Andy Bathgate launched a shot that hit him in the face, cut him.
Yeah.
He had to go into the dressing room to be stitched up. Now the question was going to be, is he coming back, or is Joe Schaefer going to join us down from the press box to be the Canadiens' goaltender? And Toe Blake was not thrilled with the idea of Joe Schaefer being his goalie. So he talked to Plant, and Plant said, I'll go back, but I have to wear the mask. Now, this had never happened before. There had been a time when a goalie named Clint Benedict, back in the early years of the NHL, wore a mask, but that was 100 years ago.
Sure.
This was never in modern hockey. No goalie ever wore a mask. In fact, Gump Worsley's autobiography, written by a friend of mine named Tim Moriarty, Gump named the book My Face is My Mask.
Right.
Well, anyway, on that night, Jacques Plant put on the mask for the first time because the Canadiens didn't want to have Joe Schaefer playing goal for them. And that was probably a wise decision. But Jacques was an innovator, and which explains why my son wanted his mask, and he got it.
Yeah.
Very cool. Hey, guys, great show. Let's do it on a regular basis. Brings a tear, let me tell you. We're talking 60 frickin' years ago.
Yeah, when you think of it that way, yeah. A long time.
Well, it's good we're all here to remember it.
Thank God.
Yeah.
We see a lot of empty air time.
Yeah.
That's right, see?
All right, gentlemen. Thank you again. Thank you for listening out there. Please stay comfortably zoned. George Grimm, Hal Bock, New York Rangers, back in the day.
Thank you
Thanks,
very much.
gentlemen.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
The proceeding was a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production. Thank you for listening.